Bueno, pues iniciaríamos con la última mesa del día de hoy. Nuestro presentador es Stephen Wilmer, es de Trinity College, y nos ven a presentar Enfrentando la frontera, una multiplicidad en el camino, Confronting the Border, a Multiplicity on the Road. So, thank you very much.
Thank you. Just to let you know that I'm speaking in English rather than Spanish, even though the title is in Spanish. Working? Direction? Okay. Can you hear me okay? Yes? So the war in Ukraine has once again raised the perennial problem of refugees and the response to them by countries throughout the world. In this paper, I will explore the Deleuzean concept of multiplicity and how it might apply to refugees from Europe and from the global south. While not addressing the problem of refugees as explicitly as, for example, Hannah Arendt or Giorgio Agamben, Deleuze and Guattari venture into the same arena with many of their concepts, such as becoming minor, nomadism, smooth space, lines of flight, deterritorialization, and a people to come. Their work can be applied to some of the social and political conditions that have prompted an increasing number of refugees worldwide. In 1,000 Plateaus, Deleuze and Guattari distinguish between arborescent multiplicities and rhizomatic multiplicities. Thus, in differentiating between the two types, Deleuze and Guattari indicate that quantitative multiplicities are essentially numerical and can be counted, whereas qualitative multiplicities cannot be counted in that they differ in kind from one another. The reasons for becoming refugees differ significantly from one individual or family to another, and their circumstances are not only diverse but are often in constant flux. Thus, we can consider refugees as both quantitative and qualitative multiplicities, and understand how the theater and the arts can reveal refugees as qualitative multiplicities by indicating their singularities and individualities. So in this paper, I will explore the Deleuzean concept of multiplicity and how it might relate to refugees, and more specifically to a theatrical production by Irene Mnuchin of Le Dernier Caravansérail Odyssée. Deleuze's notion of multiplicity comes essentially from the reading of Georg Riemann, a German mathematician, and Henri Bergson, a French philosopher. According to Jonathan Ruff, Deleuze took from Riemann, quote, the idea that any situation is composed of different multiplicities that form a kind of patchwork or ensemble without becoming a totality or whole. And from Bergson, the notion that there are two types of multiplicity, quote, extensive numerical multiplicities and continuous intensive multiplicity, unquote. In his book on Bergson, Deleuze differentiates between multiplicities represented in space and multiplicities represented in time. A multiplicity in space is a multiplicity of exteriority, of simultaneity, of juxtaposition, of order, of quantitative differentiation, of difference in degree. It's a numerical multiplicity, discontinuous and actual, unquote. By contrast, a multiplicity in duration is, quote, an internal multiplicity of succession, of fusion, of organization, of heterogeneity, of qualitative discrimination, or of difference in kind. It's a virtual and continuous multiplicity that cannot be reduced to numbers. Deleuze's notion of multiplicity developed over many years and appeared in numerous iterations and was further elaborated in conjunction with Félix Guattari. For example, in 1,000 Plateaus, they discuss multiplicity in relation to various formulations by Riemann, Meinong, and Russell and Bergson. For this paper, we can consider refugees as both quantitative and qualitative multiplicities. On the one hand, we can readily agree that refugees are countable. For example, the newspapers are filled with the numbers of refugees in camps or on the move in processions from one country to another, or have died crossing the Mediterranean. Likewise, national governments seem to consider refugees in terms of quantity. the number of refugees to be allowed into the country, the number to be housed or detained, the number to be deported. On the other hand, we can also argue that refugees are not of a single kind. Politicians, for example, often try to distinguish between economic migrants and political refugees, despite these being very broad and overlapping categories. Likewise, the United Nations has specified conditions which can be difficult to prove for refugees to achieve asylum. Quote, a refugee, according to the Convention, is someone who is unable or unwilling to return to their country of origin, owing to a well-founded fear of being persecuted for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group, or political opinion, unquote. The reasons for becoming refugees differ significantly from one individual or family to another, and their circumstances are not only diverse, but are often in constant flux. Refugees can be differentiated, for instance, by their ethnicity, gender, age, mobility, health, language, sexual orientation, nationality, skills, employability, and size and age of family members. The reasons for refugees leaving home can result from religious persecution, sexual violence, or ethnic cleansing, poverty, hunger, war, climate change, loss of home or habitat, intimidation, threats of violence, fear, dispossession, loss of legal rights, loss of employment, death, disappearance or debilitation of a family member, alteration of national boundaries, imposition of hostile or punitive laws, avoiding military, marital, religious, or other social obligations. Likewise, reasons for moving to another place can be the success of friends and family elsewhere, job opportunities, higher wages, better housing, social support, more favorable climate, a more welcoming environment to practice religion, sexual orientation, more equitable laws, more possibilities for integration, naturalization and citizenship, an opportunity to reunite with family, friends, religious or ethnic group, or simply to escape danger. Thus, at the risk of stretching Deleuze and Guattari's notion of qualitative multiplicity, we could say that refugees are qualitative multiplicities in the sense they are not identical but highly differentiated. Moreover, descriptive categories such as nomad, migrant, displaced person, asylum seeker, and refugee are often misleading. In a treatise on nomadology from 1,000 Plateaus, Deleuze and Guattari tried to differentiate between nomads and migrants. Sorry about this. The nomad distributes himself in a smooth space. He occupies, inhabits, holds that space. That is his territorial principle. It is therefore false to define the nomad by movement. If the nomad can be called the deterritorialized by par excellence, it is precisely because there's no re-territorialization afterward, as with the migrant, unquote. However, contrary to what Deleuze and Guattari suggest here, migrants and refugees do not always succeed in re-territorializing. They sometimes succeed only in deterritorializing because the process of re-territorialization may be too long and arduous or too difficult to achieve, and possibly endless. More often than not, the refugee is stopped at national borders or is held in refugee camps or detention centers awaiting asylum or deportation, or dies en route. Moreover, nomads can also re-territorialize by evolving into today's settled citizens as their conditions for survival and employment become more sedentary or governments impose restrictions on their movement or force them to migrate to the cities or to other places. Likewise, forcibly displaced persons, who are now more numerous today than ever before, reaching more than 100 million in 2022, displaced persons can behave more like nomads in certain circumstances, wanting to return home when their current danger has passed, rather than settling in another location, such as those escaping the Syrian civil war or the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Thus, Deleuze and Guattari's distinction between the migrant and the nomad does not necessarily hold true, because the lives of such individuals, including refugees and displaced persons, are in flux and evolving rather than static. Moreover, refugees sometimes move with others for self-protection as heterogeneous groups with different nationalities and languages, and in the processions of refugees from Greece towards Western Europe in 2015, or from Latin America towards the United States more recently. Such processions form and reform. Individuals and families drop out while others continue. They move at different paces, some trying to keep up, others falling away or taking different routes, similar to the packs of nomads in smooth space that Deleuze and Guattari describe as resembling their nomadic terrain. Thus, we can say that rather than being distinct, the conditions of the migrant, the refugee, and the nomad overlap. In a sense, they are all minority becomings, transforming cultural roles and social norms, and can evolve into one another. This complexity can also be seen in the way that refugees are treated when they arrive in the target country. Needless to say, this reception differs from country to country and according to the geopolitical situation. The recent Russian invasion of Ukraine saw more than 5 million people fleeing in the first weeks of the war. What was unusual about Ukrainian refugees was their overwhelming welcome by European countries. On March 2nd, 2022, Slavoj Žižek published an article, "What Does Defending Europe Mean?" Žižek wrote, he warned that, quote, "Throughout the region, two species of refugee have emerged." A tweet by the Slovene government on February 25th clarified the distinction. Quote, "The refugees from Ukraine are coming from an environment which is, in its cultural, religious, and historical sense, something totally different from the environment out of which refugees from Afghanistan are coming," unquote. After an outcry, this is all part of the same quotation from Žižek, the tweet was quickly deleted, but the obscene truth was out. Europe must defend itself from non-Europe. This approach will be catastrophic for Europe in the ongoing global struggle for geopolitical influence. Our media and the elites frame that struggle as a conflict between a Western liberal sphere and a Russian Eurasian sphere, ignoring the much larger group of countries in Latin America, the Middle East, Africa, and Southeast Asia that are observing us closely, unquote. Thus, refugees can be differentiated by their ethnicity and culture and by the way they are regarded by the countries that they approach for asylum. So now I want to move on to the Théâtre du Soleil. In this section, I will discuss some of the Théâtre du Soleil's unusually nomadic features and argue that while the state and media tend to reduce refugees to numerical multiplicities, the theater and the arts can transform them into qualitative multiplicities by indicating their singularities and individualities. Their production of Le Dernier Caravansérai Odyssée, or translated roughly as The Last Caravan Stop Odysseys, conjured up a panorama of human movement from all over the globe to convey the so-called migration crisis at the beginning of the 21st century. In their play, the Théâtre du Soleil created multiple such subjectivities and potentialities, dismantling national and linguistic boundaries in a highly evocative performance that traverses the world with boat people and other migrants leaving behind their national identities in search for a better life. In its 6-hour performance, Le Dernier Caravansérai touches on a variety of reasons and circumstances that cause migration, and it distinguishes their qualitative differences as the refugees struggle against government representatives, border guards, police, smugglers, traffickers, as well as difficulties with weather, climate, and terrain. Such situations for refugees resemble what Deleuze and Guattari attribute to the position of the nomad. The depersonalization of subjectivity, such that the subject identifies with the multiplicity of the smooth spaces they traverse or inhabit, which places them in a hostile relation to the state, as well as to sedentary existence, i.e. existence with controlled relative movement, and to striated space, actualized in a war machine, unquote. While Deleuze and Guattari praised the work of nomadic artists from different periods of history, They did not mention the Théâtre du Soleil in their work. However, it's clear that members of the theater company were strongly influenced by some of the same impulses that inspired the philosophers. Both Hélène Cixous, the writer-in-residence of the company, and Ariane Mnouchkine, its director, has referred to themselves as exiles, non-belonging or nomads. And in fact, Hélène Cixous took part in a demonstration about prisons in Paris along with Deleuze and Guattari and Michel Foucault. As well as identifying as a French company, its members represented a cross-section of the world. According to Judith Miller, quote, as of 2005, there were 75 members from 35 countries, speaking 22 different languages in the company. Their productions frequently incorporate a transnational approach both in form and content, using, for example, East Asian and South Asian theater techniques of movement, music, costume, and acting style, and addressing transformative political situations in various parts of the world. Brian Singleton argues that, quote, the company has now become as a hub for migrating theater artists, unquote. By accepting exiles into their company, housing refugees, and touring extensively, they convey the impression of a constantly changing enterprise, open to new ideas and welcoming, interpreting, and representing the dispossessed in society. Le Dernier Caravanserai Odyssée, which premiered in 2003 and continued in repertory until 2005 and then was released as a film in 2006, provides a prime example of the Théâtre du Soleil's transnational theatricality. Concerned with the European Union closing its borders to migration as well as the plight of refugees throughout the world following the collapse of the Soviet Union and various civil wars and regime changes, the last caravan stop addressed what was becoming a major geopolitical concern. The title of the play emphasizes the theme of nomadic mobility and the need for refuge that is expressed throughout the play, bearing witness to the blighted new nomads who wander the world looking for a landfall to call home, unquote. Mnouchkine and other members of the troupe visited refugee camps in Australia, New Zealand, Indonesia, and France, and interviewed many of the inhabitants, especially those at the inadequate Sangatte center near Calais that was later closed by the government, leading to the inhospitable conditions of the Calais jungle. They devised a 6-hour episodic play from verbatim testimony that they had collected from migrants. Despite its inordinate length, the pace of the performance is fast-moving, with short scenes in chaotic order, emphasizing the tumultuous lives of refugees in different countries, enduring oppressive conditions and striving to escape and reach new destinations. As Singleton points out, quote, it depicts in broad and sweeping performative brushstrokes the causes and more specifically the effects of conflict, migration, and the human trafficking, dislocation, and suffering that ensues from that migration, unquote. What? Okay. Le Dernier Caravanserai portrays refugees fleeing from many different countries in Europe, the Middle East, Asia, and Africa, including Afghanistan, Iraq, Iran, Kyrgyzstan, Russia, Bulgaria, Bosnia, and Nigeria, making their way to Western Europe as well as to Australia and New Zealand. Numerous escape scenes take place in which the characters try to cross bridges, climb fences, invade tunnels, or otherwise transgress borders. Their migration originates from a variety of causes, with scenes portraying economic migrants, people fleeing war zones, Eastern European women trafficked for sexual exploitation, and members of the Taliban passing themselves off as refugees. The play also reveals the conditions at Sangatte, near Calais, from which the refugees tried to obtain illegal passage to England by container, lorry, boat, or the Eurotunnel. The production is eclectic in its portrayal of humankind across the world, depicting many different kinds of scenes, lifestyles, and dilemmas, and serving as a strident attack on European and Australian immigration policies. It's unusual in terms of its length, its variety of locations, its use of actors from so many different countries speaking different languages, its multiple manifestations of migration. Like Deleuze's article on the exhausted, one might say that the company exhausts the possibilities of migration and the multiplicity of attempts to find a new home. So, in conclusion, rather than advocating nationalist discourses, the Théâtre du Soleil has promoted an outward-looking cosmopolitanism by welcoming people of different ethnicities and cultures from many parts of the world into its activities. Similarly, its events and performances, which have taken it to many countries in Europe, North America, and Australasia, have challenged capitalist values favoring the migratory over the sedentary, the smooth over the striated. Its artists have experimented with new forms and styles of work that have been iconoclastic and transformative in the Deleuzean sense of becoming other. Le Dernier Caravanserai bears witness to the variety and individuality of refugee lifestyles and circumstances, transforming refugees from quantitative to qualitative multiplicities and emphasizing their singularity and their becoming minor. Each refugee comprises a multiplicity with the complexities of their lives and intersections forming a patchwork rather than a clearly defined pattern or pathway. Le Dernier Caravanserai opens up ways of seeing and thinking differently about refugees and nomads, awakening audiences to the possibility of change, for hospitality, for sharing space, for dismantling borders, for inclusiveness, transnationalism, and becoming other. By portraying the diversity of humankind in migration, its work has helped to address the limitations of identity politics, ethnocentrism, sexism, religious fundamentalism, and nationalism. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much. Our next presenter is Robert. Okay. So he's going to present us Memories of Cinema.
Yeah, don't need that at all. Don't even know if I need this, except to drop it maybe. Yeah. All right. Well, I want to thank to our organizers for putting this awesome thing together. It's great. And it's nice to see everybody again. Okay, so what we're talking about here is, well, Memories of Cinema, The Memory of Cinema. I couldn't decide. It's one of those titles. And my argument basically has three stages. Okay, I suggest that Deleuze's innovative reading of Bergson's concept of duration is key to understanding how time is expressed in cinema. I observe through reference to Alain Robbe-Grier's theory of artistic descriptions that a direct image of time enjoys nascent expression in the pure form, in the form of pure optical and acoustic situations, moments of profound change in the diegetic elements of a film story, and finally, through reference again, and then there's like a return to Bergson. Through reference to Deleuze's nuanced reading of Bergson's ontology of virtual and actual modes of existence, I suggest that time gains a direct cinematic expression in the peculiar crystal images that proliferate in post-World War II cinema. So basically, one way to look at this paper or this talk is when Deleuze says that time gains direct expression in cinema, what can that possibly mean? How? Because it's like, it seems like this is a representational art form. How, like, so what's going on? And I try to unpack that. Okay, I observe that time's expression in cinema involves all of the diminishment of the relative importance of the relation of temporal succession, the prioritization of time's involvement with a fundamental ontological change, and a specification of the strictly simultaneous emergence of past and present. Further, I suggest that this temporality forms a continuum of variation without end. Taken together, these yield the claim that the direct presentation of time in cinema involves characterizing temporality as a singularity that is intrinsic to the cinematic mode of artistic expression. Perhaps the most magical of all art forms, cinema continues to delight us and beguile us in no small measure due to its capacity to express a little morsel of time as pure, unceasing variation. So, that's basically what I'm doing. First section, the filmic duration of memory and change. Okay, Deleuze's suggestion that temporality is afforded direct presentation in film involves a Bergsonian concept of temporal duration that is comprehensive of the memorial past of memory and the lived present and the creation of the new. What this implies about the nature of temporality and the nature of cinematic expression is staggering, if for no other reason than it involves three things here: a reconceptualization of temporality that establishes an identity relation among putatively discrete temporal domains. 2, a diminishment of the claim that temporality is reducible to a succession relation, T1, T2, Tn. 3, a suggestion that cinema can represent these. So, Bergson never seems to tire of modifying his concept of duration. It's really quite frustrating. In a few remarkable pages in the second chapter of Time and Free Will, the concept of duration is variously characterized as 1, a multiplicity of temporal moments which don't enjoy any correlation with measurable points in distributed physical space, a multiplicity of pure number, the form assumed by the succession of our conscious states in moments of recollection, an intensive magnitude, a mercurial ontological process which seems to be like Merleau-Ponty's concept of the flesh in the narrow sense that it is primary to substance, Aristotelian substance explicitly. In matter and memory, this overdetermined concept undergoes further revision. Here, duration is characterized as the continuous flow of mental states through which psychosocial entities insensibly pass in the really lived experience of a continuity that strangely conditions experience without revealing itself in its entirety. It is also shown to be expressed explicitly as the dynamic tension that obtains among various putatively discrete mental states. This characterization in particular becomes slightly more fraught when taken in conjunction with Bergson's careful observation that any of the supposed division among mental states is artificial in the sense that these are comprehended as interrelated aspects of a unified, non-divisible, non-reducible lived experience. And you're like, okay, that's enough. No. The situation doesn't get any better when we get to creative evolution. Here, Bergson characterizes duration variously as the flow of unceasing change, a flux of putatively discrete mental states merging into one another, the past characterized as an oddly active and expanding process which quote, gnaws into the future and which swells as it advances. Taken together, this dizzying array of sometimes competing definitions suggests an overdetermined concept that threatens to just go off the rails, lose any sense of unity. Now, Hippolyte suggests that Bergsonian duration is identical to memory, in the sense that it involves an interrelation of non-discrete temporal moments that are temporally prior to, non-discrete moments that are temporally prior to the present. Bergson, in Creative Evolution, explicitly identifies memory and duration when he observes that duration is the continuing process of the past gnawing into the future. Bergson's choice of metaphor and verb tense suggests a conceptualization of memory as a process that is substantively different from the concept of memory as a mental repository of prior experience which resist washing away into oblivion like tears in the rain. In Matter and Memory, Bergson elucidates on memory's active gnawing into the future through reference to the mental activity of recording occurrences in the temporal present for the purpose of forming habits which might become involved in shaping a psychosocial entity's behaviors at a future moment. The dynamic aspect of memory is further illustrated by Bergson's careful observation that habit participates in the formation of moral obligation. Bergson further elaborates on the aims of memory. It's when he notes that each of the moments of our lives is a kind of creation. When taken in conjunction with the stipulation that each temporal moment of existence involves both the content of memory and the ongoing organization of this concept, Bergson's observation yields the implication that memory is involved in the dynamic creation of the utterly unique. No longer identified as merely the repository of now past, slowly fading moments, Bergson suggests that memory is identical to duration, in the sense that all of its nature, processes, and purpose are involved with the creation of something without ontological correlate or precedent. Deleuze clarifies the role of duration in the production of difference with his elucidation of Bergson's third thesis of movement and change in Cinema 1. So, and now here's just a schematic of a 6-step argument that Deleuze puts forward. So, Bergson's complex ontological argument, according to Deleuze, involves 1. The stipulation of a distinction among processes of transformation and translation. 2. Positing an uncontentious distinction in kind, a categorical distinction among quantities and qualities. 3. The observation that the process of translation involves quantitative change. It is a translation of quantitative values. 4. The inference that transformation involves modification of particular qualities. 5. The observation of the corollary that movements in space involve qualitative changes. And finally, 6. The assertion that the transformation of a particular quality implies a qualitative change to the generality that comprehends the particular. So what does that all mean? Taken together, these yield the claim that a displacement of spatio-temporally extended entities implies a fundamental change to the nature of space itself. In this sense, the domain or medium that comprehends the movements of particulars is revealed to be ontologically correlated with a modification of the qualities of any particular. Deleuze suggests that filmic duration does something more profound than merely presenting photographic examples of differentiation through photographic and auditory means. In Bergson's conception of difference, Deleuze explicitly identifies duration as the internally differentiated process that involves the capacity to englobe distinct entities. This suggests that the particular filmic species of duration has the capacity to comprehend modifications within entities which are ontologically discrete from filmed persons, settings, and other photographically represented states of affairs. The implication here is that filmic duration involves the capacity to affect, to qualitatively modify the audience, because the audience is englobed with it. Now, there's a whole bunch of phenomenology that went into that last claim, and where might it, like, what would be another way to get at this? In garden, how the viewer participates with the cinema. That's the literary work of art. And Merleau-Ponty has language like that in Eye and Mind too. All the artwork speaking to people. Now, next section. Nascent form of time's direct expression. In some of the most beautiful passages of cinema too, Deleuze suggests that filmic art enjoys the power to modify the qualitative experience of viewers because it has the capacity to present direct images of time. And this is like one of the weirdest things about the cinema texts. The direct image of time. What is that? It is as mercurial to understanding the complex nature. It's key to understanding what Deleuze is getting at in film. Deleuze starkly identifies the direct image of time as presenting a little piece of time in its pure state, only to clarify that this pure state is the unchanging form in which the change is produced. The suggestion here is the general form of variation, is that time is the general form of variation that comprehends and is expressed in any particular change. One might observe that a direct presentation of anything in film seems flummoxing, if for no other reason than the entities of a film are explicitly visually accessible entities as elements of that are accessible as elements of a filmic universe. They seem to be representations. How do you get away from that? Deleuze addresses these concerns through reference to Robbe-Grillet, his theory of artistic description. Deleuze suggests that temporality enjoys direct presentation in film as a type of intrinsic singularity that expresses a sort of variation that is non-mimetic. So in time and description in fiction today, Robbe-Grillet elaborates an account of the descriptions that diminishes the ancient suggestion that art tends to be mimetic. Tends to be representational. And we know all these arguments from Plato, from Aristotle. They both have this. Robbe-Grillet thinks they were wrong. Robbe-Grillet cautiously observes that though it might have been the case that filmic and literary narratives seem to involve duplication, producing a copy or representation of the real world, in contemporary films and literature, the mimetic function seems to only enjoy a diminished role, in the sense that it has been supplanted by a creative function. Robbe-Grillet further observes that intrinsic singularities tend to gain artistic expression as diegetic moments of radical upheaval, profound correction, or a bifurcation into non-compossible series of events. Robbe-Grillet explicitly notes that his conception of artistic description is distinct from the mimetic relation through direct reference to temporality, when he observes that the types of temporal changes expressed in film do not correlate with the temporality evidenced by the quantitative measurement of physical as opposed to artificially presented clocks and calendars. Yeah, five minutes? Holy shit. Okay. Quickly. So, crystals of time. There are three characteristics of it. Of a crystal of time. The continual exchange among the couple of the virtual and actual. The limpid and the opaque. And the generation of seed and environment. The virtual and actual is the key one, really. What is the distinction? The claim is from Bergson that both causal efficacy and materiality may be predicated of actual entities. So actual entities, they're causally efficacious, particularly the material cause, the efficient cause, and they're material. Virtual entities enjoy none of the capacities to be influenced by entities that enjoy physical material existence. Virtual entities are immaterial and neutral with respect to material causation. In contradistinction, if an entity is actual, and if it is causally relevant in a material circumstance. If one were to characterize materiality and causal efficacy as ontological conditions which must be met for an object to enjoy actuality, then one must observe that virtual entities do not obtain as actual because they fail to fulfill these. Bergson positively identifies the virtual as the ontological domain which is most closely resembles the plane of a dream. Virtual entities enjoy the predication of immateriality, seems to say that they're abstract entities or possibilities. Citing Proust's formulation, Deleuze cautiously observes that, quote, the virtual is real without being actual, ideal without being abstract. Deleuze observes that the possible may be conceptualized as that which subsists in opposition to the real, in the sense that what is possible is not yet realized. The possible does not obtain as something realized in the sense that it obtains as either that which is ontologically prior or that which is realized as a potential result that has not been of a deduction that has not yet been made. The suggestion here is that possibility enjoys a modality that is categorically distinct from that of real entities. The possible has no reality. Deleuze goes on to say, well, essentially, the crystal image is a relation of virtual and actual. Bergson suggests that the past and the present emerge at exactly the same duration. So, putting this all together, I know I'm running really short on time. What does this mean? How does cinema present the direct image of time? Well, it's non-mimetic. That's what we take from Robbe-Grillet. That's what Deleuze takes from Robbe-Grillet. Okay, so it's not representative of the real world. It's it's a self-enclosed universe where time, all of it, emerges at every moment. And then you're like, okay, great. So if this film is a self-enclosed universe, then how do I have any reference to it whatsoever? And then we bring in that weird language of englobing, which is just englobing, which is comprehending. And it's like, yes, it is a self-enclosed universe which involves us, the audience. So it's a direct presentation of time. It is an expression of time with which we all participate. And I had a lovely Proust quote, but that's the end. We're good. Thanks.
Well, our next colleague to present is Daniel Smith. He's going to present the pure form of time and the powers of the false.
Thank you. Well, thank you for being here, and like everyone, thanks to the organizers for putting together this wonderful conference. I'm going to ask your indulgence and actually present a different paper than the one I put into the schedule, partly because it's some work I'm doing on philosophy of technology and Bernard Stiegler, and I'm consoled and encouraged that Phelan's paper early on touched on some of the themes I'm going to want to talk about. So my paper is short, but it has 12 sections, so I consider these maybe occur to me like Twitter, little tweets. They're like about a minute each. It's just so you can follow what I'm doing. So the new title of my paper is called Kant's Schematism Solved on Time and Technology. So first tweet, the introduction. As you may know, Kant develops his concept of the schematism in a short 10-page section of the Critique of Pure Reason published in 1781, where he describes the schematism as, quote, an art concealed in the depths of the human soul, whose real modes of activity nature is hardly ever to allow us to discover and have open to our gaze. 166 years later, in 1947, Adorno and Horkheimer, in their book Dialectic of Enlightenment, announced rather dramatically that, quote, the secret of the schematism has now been revealed. And the unraveling, they say, took place in what they called the culture industry. So it's a rather sensational, I think, philosophical moment. Adorno and Horkheimer claimed to have discovered a mechanism of the schematism that Kant himself thought would forever remain hidden in the depths of nature. And it's the philosopher Bernard Stiegler who has pointed out this drama and developed it most fully. So really, just to lay on my cards on the table, I agree with what Adorno and Horkheimer are saying about Kant as well as Stiegler, and that the answer has to do with technology. And I just want to spend my paper exploring some of the consequences of that argument as briefly and as quickly as I can. So tweet 2. Then, what is the problem of the schematism? And it's related to the problem of synthesis in Kant. Kant's doctrine of the schematism attempts to address a problem that lies at the heart of Kant's philosophy. For Kant, knowledge is the application of concepts to intuitions or perceptions. We need both in order to have knowledge. So when I say this is a red rose, or this is a round table, or a square table, rectangular table, I'm applying a concept or a set of concepts to a manifold of sensations. But the problem Kant faced was this. Perceptions are spatial temporal. They're in space and time, whereas concepts are not. They're not spatial temporal. So how can they be brought together? To answer this question, Kant famously invented two concepts, synthesis and schematism. Both are operations of the faculty of the imagination, the productive imagination, and in both cases, it's a matter of determining a space and time that corresponds to a concept. So, quick examples. The act of synthesis begins on the side of intuitions or perceptions, and it requires, Kant says, two temporal operations. The first is apprehension. I have to apprehend the manifold of sensations that are before me, which takes a certain amount of time. I may begin, for instance, by seeing the legs of this table, and then the surface, and then the color of the surface. And then, Kant says, I require the faculty of memory, or what Kant calls reproduction. If I look at the legs when I'm apprehending the color of the surface, I won't recognize these intuitions as corresponding to a table. So every act of synthesis thus requires that I apprehend and remember a sensory multiplicity in the here and now. The act of schematism, by contrast, goes from concept to intuition rather than perception or intuition to concepts. It begins on the side of concepts and asks, given a concept, how can I produce an intuition in space and time that corresponds to that concept? I can rather easily define the concept of a circle, a figure whose points are all equidistant from a center point, but a schema will show me how I can produce a circle in space and time. For instance, using a compass where the center is stationary and making it going around that center point. In a similar fashion, Husserl suggested that between the circle as a concept and images of a circle, such as a plate or a wheel, there is a schema or vague essence, he called it, that he calls roundness. I have a few other examples, but I'll skip them. The point is, schemata are ways of being in space and time, complexes or blocks of space-time, what Deleuze would call rhythmic blocks or spatial temporal dynamisms. So that's just the problem. Tweet 3 then, interpreting the schematism. So from Heidegger to Deleuze to Stiegler. The essential point is that for Kant, synthesis and schematism constitute the two fundamental acts of knowledge, and it's hard to overemphasize their importance on subsequent philosophy. Heidegger, in 1929, he published his Kant book, translated as Kant and the Problem of Metaphysics, and it focused almost exclusively on the thematism as an activity of the productive imagination. While Deleuze's 1968 Difference and Repetition developed Kant's doctrine of the schematism against Heidegger in the direction of a modified theory of ideas, saying it's not really the imagination that's at stake, but something different. But in the wake of Adorno and Horkheimer's claim that they have uncovered the secret of the schematism, Bernard Stiegler, I would argue, takes a step beyond both Heidegger and Deleuze on this question toward a philosophy of technology. The schematism was a mystery to Kant because he thought it was an operation hidden, quote, in the depths of the human soul. But it turns out that he was looking in the wrong place. Schematism is an act that takes place outside the human soul or psyche, even outside the human body. It turns out that the schematism is a service that is offered to us by industry, and in particular for Adorno and Horkheim, the culture industry in particular, and then Stiegler is going to say more generally, technical artifacts. So this is what I want to explore here. So tweet 4 then. So we're going quickly. Stiegler interpreting Husserl. Now, in developing this technological thesis, Stiegler turns to a rereading of Husserl's classic work, The Phenomenology of Internal Time Consciousness, which Stiegler rightly sees as a parallel to Kant's theory of the schematism, his response to Kant. The two great discoveries of the Husserlian phenomenology of time consciousness are the concepts, as you may know, of retention and protension. And Husserl argues that thinking in all its forms is a temporal fabric woven out of primary and secondary protensions and retentions and protensions. So quickly, as an example of a primary retention, consider a temporal object like a melody or a lecture, me talking here, something that unfolds in time, like my talk today, or all our talks today. It is not that each note of a piece of music or word of my lecture simply appears and then disappears. You understand the sentence I am speaking now because you not only retain the previous words when a new word appears, but you also start to expect certain words to appear next, giving your understanding of the language and my intentions and what I'm talking about. In other words, the here and now is not merely a point that disappears as quickly as it appears, but has a kind of thickness or longitudinality, he says. You preserve the immediate past, retention, and develop an expectation of the immediate future, a protension. And these primary retentions and protensions are phenomena of your direct perception of time itself, right now as you're listening to me. Secondary retentions, by contrast, are what we usually mean by memory. I can recall today a lecture or a melody I heard yesterday or this morning, and indeed I can recall it multiple times and largely at will. Yet it is precisely these secondary retentions, Husserl says, your memories, that affect how you understand what I am saying now as I speak, and what you are paying attention to in your primary retentions. For instance, someone who has never heard of Bernard Stiegler perhaps drifted off when I mentioned his name today, while someone who has been reading his work may have perked up and suddenly taken a greater interest in what I'm saying. In other words, in Husserl, there's a complicated relation between my primary retentions, the flow of my thinking in the present, and the way these primary retentions function as synthesizers. You're synthesizing time as you're listening to me, and the way in which they are conditioned or schematized by your secondary retentions or memories. It's your memories that make you select from the temporal flow of my talk today what you're interested in. So your thinking is a combination of both of those things. So tweet 5 then. But this is where Stiegler then will go beyond Husserl and add to these primary and secondary retentions what he calls a tertiary retention, a third form of retention, which is a form of cultural memory, an externalized memory that determines my thinking in the present and schematizes it even more than my individual memory. To understand Stiegler's claim, consider the fact that each of us participates in at least 3 types of memory. There is, of course, the first type, which is what we usually mean by memory, which is my individual memory, my recollection of what happened yesterday, my childhood, the talks I heard this morning. The second memory, which would be fun to discuss, but I'm going to eliminate a whole section here, is your genetic memory. In other words, it's the memory of the species, which is ensconced in your genome, which is what has produced your body and is continuing to produce your body as we sit here today through a complex process of chemical signaling. We can say genetics is a perfect memory, and I'm going to pass on that memory to my children, and that memory will produce their bodies. So we don't usually think of that as a memory, but it is. But the third memory, which is what interests Stiegler, is a memory that lies between my individual memory and my genetic memory. It is a cultural memory, or more specifically, a technical memory, a technological memory, both at the same time. So tweet 6 then, writing as an externalized memory. So this is a classic example, but perhaps the paradigmatic example of tertiary memory then is writing, which among many other things is an externalization of memory outside the body, hence mnemotechnics in Nietzsche's term. In oral societies, or pre-literate societies, as one says sometimes, any knowledge that existed had to be retained in the mind. Hence the respect showed to elders who were literally repositories of knowledge, libraries, so to speak, knowledge that could simply disappear when the person died. But once knowledge was written down and externalized outside the body, it could be stored in books and libraries or even in computer chips now, and was available for consultation anytime, or available for annihilation. You know, like think of like destruction of the Alexandrian library or the burning of Mayan books, in Central America at a certain point. Philosophy itself was made possible by writing, as evidenced by the confrontation between Plato, who championed writing, and Socrates, who refused writing and praised living speech. Writing also produced an entirely new form of religion, what we call religions of the book. Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, which are oriented around the interpretation of text and thus utterly focused on the technology of writing. One could say they are technological religions. Our smartphones have taken this movement, obviously, to the most recent extreme. Our smartphones are literally a memory bank that we hold in our hands. When we want to recall something, we no longer need to rack our brains. We simply open up our phones and Google it, because the memory is now outside of us. Now, it is this third memory, cultural memory, this technological memory, that Stigler calls tertiary memory. So it's not a great phrase, but cultural memory maybe is a little better. And it constitutes the object of what is called the philosophy of technology, at least for Stigler. Stigler argues that it's primarily this externalized cultural memory that schematizes our thought. It's the answer to the problem of schematization. This is what Kant did not and could not have seen. A newborn child arrives into a world in which this cultural memory both precedes it and awaits it. And indeed, the aim of our educational institutions is to initiate each of us into this cultural memory, like to inscribe it in our minds and bodies, to teach us in part, as we say in English, reading, writing, and arithmetic, the 3 R's. To the degree that the way we think becomes conditioned and schematized by this tertiary memory, this cultural memory. So section 6, let me go on time. Okay. The classic schema of the philosophy of technology. Now, in making this claim, Stigler is drawing on what we might call a classic schema in the history and the philosophy of technology, which was initially proposed in 1877 by the German philosopher Ernst Kapp, who wrote a book called Elements in the Philosophy of Technology. It was the first book that had that phrase, philosophy of technology, in its title, so rather late, 1877. Kapp proposed a dialectic theory of technicity that had 3 moments: externalization, objectification, and then internalization. In the first moment, we externalize the organs and functions of our body outside of ourselves in technological artifacts. Writing, as we see, externalizes memory. A hammer is the externalization of my forearm and fist in wood and metal. A baby's bottle is an externalization of the mother's breast. Clothing externalizes the skin. Your stove and utensils found in your kitchen are extensions of the digestive tract. The wheel externalizes the quasi-spherical articulations of our hips, knees, and ankles. And our senses are externalized in artifacts like telescopes, microphones, radio dishes, as big ears, and so on. But such artifacts, in a second moment, become objectified. Though produced by us, they become objects that are detached from us, as if they were our externalized body or our constructed niche, and they enter into their own evolutionary history. They evolve quicker than we do. So when people talk about the fast pace of modern life, it's this externalized body that's evolving much quicker than our organic bodies. Kevin Kelly has aptly termed this externalized technical body of ours the technium. I like that. It's a nice phrase for this, everything around us is part of this externalized body. And then thirdly, each of us as individuals wind up internalizing this technium into our own organic body, to the point where we treat technological artifacts like our smartphones essentially as externalized organs of our organic body. So we're carrying around an externalized organ with us all the time in your smartphones. It is precisely here in this moment of internalization that the technium becomes an agent of schematization. Now, to make Stigler's rather abstract claim that schematization is something that takes place in technology, I want to conclude with 3 quick examples and then make some concluding comments. So, tweet 7. First example, sensory motor schemata. First, consider the keypad on your computer. All of us know how to type, which means we have a knowledge of the layout of the keyboard on your computer. But if I ask you to tell me, based on this knowledge, what are the 2 keys immediately to the left and right of, say, the letter C on your keyboard? I don't know. Can you get the answer? Most of us can't. I tried this. I heard someone give this, and I thought it was a great example. Can't give the answer. The correct answer is, at least on the American keyboard, X to the left and V. No, X to the right and V to the left. Well, this is a curious thing. Why do you not know that, even though you know how to type? It's because our knowledge of the keyboard has been so deeply internalized, literally, as Nietzsche said, incorporated, made part of your corporeality, that it has become, as it were, an organ of our body. That's why you can work on it so quickly, a habit of which we are no longer conscious. Or consider your eating habits. Most of us in the West have learned how to use a knife, fork, and spoon as externalized utensils for eating, but recall the moment when you first tried to, say, use chopsticks. Your hand and fingers fumbled around awkwardly until eventually the use of the chopstick likewise became internalized and incorporated into your body. And such examples can be multiplied almost indefinitely, but the obvious fact is technical objects literally become incorporated to the body, in our body, in the form of what Deleuze calls, following Bergson, sensory motor schemata, or habits. Indeed, Nietzsche said that the most perfect knowledge humans have is this knowledge that's been incorporated into our bodies, and that consciousness usually indicates a lack of knowledge against most of the philosophical tradition. So when you're learning how to type, your consciousness has to intervene and look at the keyboard. But once you master typing, then consciousness disappears because it's a lesser knowledge than this knowledge, this perfect knowledge that's been incorporated into our body. So that's a first example of technical schematization. A second example, so tweet 10, the culture industry, comes from precisely what Adorno and Horkheimer called the culture industry. In the 20th century, the technium changed radically with the introduction of analog technologies such as the photograph and the phonograph, which made possible the mechanical reproduction, as Walter Benjamin put it in a famous essay, of both images and sounds, and led to the industrialization of culture in mass-produced movies, television programs, popular music, and video clips. The culture industry, they argued, has not only led to a standardization and homogenation of experience on a large scale and a consequent loss of subjective singularity, it has also been responsible for a mass synchronization of video and audio content to the point where the consciousness and memory of all of us tend to become one. As paradigmatic examples, think of the millions of people who watch a Super Bowl game or a World Cup final all at the same time. So it's not only that this cultural memory schematizes our thought, it also synchronizes it so that we all tend to become homogeneous and thinking the same thing at the same time. The political consequences of the culture industry obviously are profound. We allow the management of our bodies, our ideas, our entertainment, all our imaginary needs to be externally imposed by the technium, by the culture industry. It becomes a kind of intellectual Taylorism in which we choose to do what we are told to do. Or as you said earlier today, what does Google do? Google search gives us exactly what we are looking for. We don't get anything new. We're in our epistemic bubbles. So second type of schematization then at the level of the imagination. A third type, quickly then, tweet 11, almost done. Algorithmic governmentality. You may have heard this phrase recently. Third, the advent of digital technologies rather than analog technologies has introduced what has been called a new algorithmic governmentality, which is based on the collection and automatic storage of big data, which is then analyzed by algorithms to anticipate and preemptively affect our behavior. This is no longer based on what Foucault called surveillance, but what Burns and Rouvroy, people who coined this term algorithmic governmentality, say might be called data valence, not surveillance, but data valence, based on algorithmic governance. One could say that this is indeed a new form of power, a new form of governmentality in Foucault's sense, one that grasps subjects no longer through their physical body, as in what Foucault called disciplinary power, but rather through the profiles that have been assigned to them. For instance, you're a possible fraudster or a consumer, a potential terrorist, a student with high potential, a more or less untrustable and productive employee, and so forth. Like your data profiles you in a certain way, and that's what's become important. In other words, as Deleuze and Guattari said, we are no longer individuals, which literally means something not divisible, but we have become what Guattari called dividuals. In other words, subjects that are endlessly divisible and reducible to discrete units of data and are in continuous modulation, continuous variation. Indeed, it was precisely the advent of algorithmic governmentality that Deleuze was anticipating in his essay on control societies. So a third example then of schematization, first at the body and then imagination, this one at the level of power, just as ad hoc sort of categories here. So tweet 12 then, conclusion. Okay. So these are just three examples that support Stigler's fundamental claim, which I basically agree with, that the schematization of our thinking takes place outside of ourselves in the technium, and that the philosophy of technology provides the solution to the mystery of the Kantian schematism in a certain sense going beyond even Heidegger and Deleuze. So one final illustration of this, and then a couple comments. So the illustration is this. If I asked you to do a fairly straightforward calculation, for instance, multiply 67 times 89, most of us could not do it in our heads, but we could do it fairly quickly by doing the calculation on a piece of paper with a pencil or pen, and obviously even more quickly with a calculator. In these cases, the thought process takes place not in your brain, not in your head, but in your hand, and more precisely, your hand holding a pencil, scribbling marks on a piece of paper. So the thinking takes place literally outside your head, your brain neurons are involved, but they don't give you the solution. The answer, by the way, is 5,963, in case anyone thought they could do it in their head. On this score, James Gleick relates a story about the famous Nobel Prize-winning physicist Richard Feynman. When a historian, Charles Weiner, showed Feynman, who was writing his biography, showed Feynman a batch of his notes and said they represented a record of Feynman's day-to-day work, Feynman reacted with unexpected sharpness. I actually did the work on the paper, he said. Well, Weiner said, the biographer, the work was done in your head, but the record of it is still here, thankfully. No, Feynman replies, it is not a record. Not really, it's working. You have to do the work on paper, and this is the paper where the work happened, where the thinking happened, okay? So it's exactly this point, making like the thing, it's a famous theme now in the extended mind thesis, Andy Clark and David Chalmers, if you know that paper. But it's a much older theme in the philosophy of technology. So one final example then of this idea of externalization, and thinking takes place technologically. When you go to mathematics department, like there's marks all over the chalkboard with chalk, and the chalkboard, that's where the thinking takes place, not necessarily in your head. So that's Stigler's argument. And I just want to conclude very quickly with two places where, even though I think Stigler goes beyond Deleuze, I actually think Deleuze anticipates Stigler's arguments and might actually help us to modify them. First, it is perhaps Bergson's theory of memory that provides the best metaphysical basis for this theory of thought as something externalized. Bergson said that memories are not preserved in our brains. I've never quite wrapped my head around this thesis, but rather are preserved outside of ourselves in time and in duration. Just as, Bergson says, in order to perceive a table in the room next door, I do not look inside myself, but I have to go over there into the room where the table is so I can perceive it. So Bergson argues that when I want to retrieve a memory or collection, I have to go look for it not inside my head, but outside of myself to the place in time where the recollection is preserved. I have to go and find it, and then I can remember it. Memory is not inside me. It is I who exist within memory, a memory that is external to me, and a memory that is perhaps provides the ultimate ground for this theory of technological externalization. So that would be something one would have to develop. Second, one of the themes of Anti-Oedipus is that libidinal economy and political economy are one and the same economy, and thus that we have no need to conjure up mechanisms such as externalization or internalization, which is what we find in what I've called the classical schema of the philosophy of technology. What we would need to do then is to tie Stigler's approach to schematization with Deleuze's theory of assemblages or agencement, which replaces this dialect of externalization and internalization with a theory of milieu. There's an internal milieu, an external milieu, an intermediate milieu, and then Simondon's concept of associated milieu, which would get rid of this sort of dialectical approach that is kind of classic in the philosophy of technology. But that would be a topic for a different paper. So that's it. Thank you.
Our last colleague to present is Bernard Cisny, and he's going to talk about time, truth, and the power of the false. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Can you all hear me? All right. I want to say thank you to the conference organizers and thank you to all of you for coming out. Time, truth, and the power of the false. So in his parabolic masterpiece, Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Friedrich Nietzsche famously writes, "Of three metamorphoses of the spirit, I tell you, how the spirit becomes a camel, and the camel a lion, and the lion finally a child." Nietzsche traces a progression through the toilsome bearing of a culture's truths and values to the sacred no-saying of leonine adolescence, whereby those truths are cast off, and finally to a renewed power of innocence and forgetfulness that enables genuine creation. The child knows no shame or inhibitions, longs for and believes in the impossible, and forms playful assemblages with anyone, human or non-human, real or imaginary, willing and able to do so. Each day she creates her world anew, while the man of the so-called real world fritters his life away, resentfully paying obeisance to his ideological and corporate masters. To enter the kingdom, one must become a child. Truth itself, Nietzsche also infamously claims, is a movable host of metaphors, metonymies, and anthropomorphisms, illusions which we have forgotten are illusions, calling into question the very value of truth itself and of the drive that sets truth upon its pedestal in the clouds, sacrificing everything upon its altar. In place of the will to truth, Nietzsche provocatively emphasizes the process of truth creation, which, he argues, is a kind of artistry. Given the pride of place that Nietzsche occupies in the thinking of Gilles Deleuze, it is hardly surprising that when Deleuze approaches the question of truth, and in particular its relation to creation, as in his expansive two-volume taxonomy of the cinema, his discussion is framed by Nietzsche's critiques of truth. In place of Nietzsche's camel, lion, and child, Deleuze casts the chain of the truthful man, the forger, and finally the artist. And it's the forger and their relation to the artist with which this paper is primarily concerned. Through his creative conceptual taxonomy, Deleuze temporalizes the very concept of truth, tracing the history of the concepts of the cinema and the ways in which these concepts think their own history, as well as the history of their present and perhaps their future. This is a quote. "A theory of cinema is not about cinema, but about the concepts that cinema gives rise to, and which are themselves related to other concepts, corresponding to other practices, the practice of concepts in general having no privilege over others." One of the most perplexing concepts in the cinema volumes is the, quote, power of the false, which replaces and supersedes the form of the true, end quote. This power is connected to what Deleuze in the cinema volumes characterizes as truth. What the artist is creator of truth. Because truth is not to be achieved, formed, or reproduced, it has to be created. There is no other truth than the creation of the new. Speaking broadly, we can say that truth has been traditionally characterized in terms that are static, atemporal, and positive in senses that are at once ontological, epistemic, and moral, while falsehood has been predominantly characterized as an absence, a lack of truth or of reality. Thus, the task of this paper will be to explore the connections between the power of the false and the creation of truth. To do so, we must look at the reasons for which Deleuze argues that, quote, time has always put the notion of truth into crisis. We'll characterize this crisis of truth in its Aristotelian sense. We'll then look at the notion of incompossibility that Deleuze adopts from Leibniz, whereby he offers a forking of incompossibilities as the basic form of time, as a strategy for responding to the notion of truth that is put into crisis. This is the sense of the power of the false that we will explore. Finally, we will see how this power of the false, as Deleuze conceives it, makes possible the creation of truth in the form of minor art that conduces to the invention of a people. Section 2. Throughout the history of philosophy, there has always been an antagonistic relation between truth and time, in that time is precisely what the philosophical conception of truth attempts to repress or overcome. So Plato, right, truth is eternal, unchanging, outside of space and time, and all knowledge is oriented by those things, not the stuff in the world, right? Aristotle deepens and formalizes this antagonism with his articulation of the problem that would come to be known as the problem of future contingents, statements of possibility concerning future events. In chapter 9 of his De Interpretatione, Aristotle writes, "With regard to what is and what has been, it is necessary for the affirmation or the negation to be true or false. But with particulars that are going to be, it is different." So it's either true or false to say that it is raining or it rained yesterday, but the claim it might rain tomorrow is subject to different considerations. to say that it may rain tomorrow is akin to saying it is possible that it will rain tomorrow, and it is possible that it will not rain tomorrow, which opens us to problems when you think about truth as unchanging, right? In that one of these eventualities will not come to pass, and will therefore turn out to have been false. Deleuze frames the problem in the following way. If it is true that a naval battle may take place tomorrow, how are we to avoid one of the true following consequences? Either the impossible proceeds from the possible, since if the battle takes place, it is no longer possible that it may not take place, or the past is not necessarily true, since the battle could have not taken place. Aristotle endeavors to solve the problem by arguing that propositions regarding future contingents must be understood as neither true nor false. The Stoics offer a different resolution to the problem of future contingents. Of the two statements, the sea battle will take place and the sea battle will not take place, they say one is true and the other is false, and they are so necessarily, even if we are unable to discern their truth or falsity beforehand. However semantically overburdened this whole exercise may appear, it nonetheless demonstrates the complications that arise whenever we bring the concept of truth into interaction with the notion of time. Third section. It is Leibniz who, for Deleuze, proposes the most interesting solution to Aristotle's problem of future contingents, and thereby to the relation between time and truth. Distinguishing between necessary and contingent truths, Leibniz argues that, quote, necessary truths depend upon the principle of contradiction. So we analyze the terms of the proposition, it becomes evident that the predicate is contained within the subject, as in the hackneyed example that all bachelors are unmarried men. This does not appear to be so for contingent truths. It does not appear to be so for contingent truths. However, for while it may be true to say that my car is blue, there is nothing analytically contradictory in the claim that my car is red. Nevertheless, even regarding contingent truths, Leibniz claims, it is still the case that, quote, there is always underneath a reason for the truth. That is, there is ultimately an exhaustive explanatory account for why it is that I own this particular car, why the car was on the lot that day, why this particular car happened to have been painted blue. And this is so even if he says the reason is understood completely only by God. So even in the case of contingent truths, for Leibniz, the predicate is ultimately contained within the subject. So we return to the naval battle. The naval battle may or may not take place. Each fleet involved in the battle consists of ships and cannons, each of which is guided and operated by individual human beings, and each of these, the human beings, the cannons, the ships, the fleets, is itself a subject containing within it all the predicates pertaining to it. But the predicates within any one of these subjects could be different only if the predicates in all the other subjects were complementarily adjusted. So, I can't be going to war with, this person if this person is not also going to battle with me, right? Each individual subject in the cosmos, along with every predicate pertaining thereto, is part of a vast and intricately orchestrated, finely tuned series. In his primary truths, Leibniz writes, every individual substance contains in its perfect notion the entire universe and everything that exists in it, past, present, and future. So, Leibniz then accounts for the notion of possibility by claiming that there are, in fact, an infinite number of these series, right? An infinite number of series of possible things. Moreover, one series cannot be contained within another since each and every one of them is complete. Each is complete in the sense that each one consists of its plenum of subjects, each of which is finely determined by its predicates, all of which reflect all the other predicates within all the other subjects in that one individual series. So possibility then is expressed in Leibniz's terminology by way of an infinity of these possible worlds or series. In the mind of God, each of which consists of all the possible subjects with their finely harmonized arrangement of predicates, each of which reflects all the others in a unique way. However, while each of these worlds is technically possible, because God could have brought any one of them into being, right, they are each incompossible with all the others. Only one can be real. The world in which Adam does not sin is incompossible with the world in which Adam sins. God creates sub ratione possibilitatis as many, and that's Leibniz's phrase, as many divergent atoms as there are worlds, each atom containing, atom A-D-A-M, containing the entire world to which he belongs, and to which also by including it belong all other compossible monads or substances of such a world. Deleuze writes, Leibniz says that the naval battle may or may not take place, but that this is not in the same world. It takes place in one world and does not take place in a different world. And these two worlds are possible, but not compossible with each other. So with this notion, Leibniz attempts to sidestep the two undesirable solutions to the problem of future contingents as offered by Aristotle and the Stoics. According to Leibniz, it is not the impossible, but only the incompossible that proceeds from the possible, and the past may be true without being necessarily true. Okay, section 4. So take a breath. Okay. There are at least two problems with this characterization, however. The possibility of an event or an eventuality only obtains on account of its existing in one or more of the possible worlds in the mind of God. However, given that God created this particular world and not one of the infinitely many other possible worlds in God's mind, it is not, in fact, possible that any other eventualities besides the ones that do occur could occur. And this seems a most limited and unsatisfying notion of possibility, as it would seem to suggest an openness of eventualities, right? On Leibniz's understanding, that openness is foreclosed by God the moment he brings into existence this particular possible world and not some other. And secondly, it presents a problematic notion of time, or at least it seems to presuppose a problematic notion of time, insofar as it seems to require some kind of a smallest isolable unit of time that would be required in order to determine the limits of that unit that would determine the next unit and the next unit and the next unit and so forth. And one of the most significant analyses of the logic of sense is the distinction lifted from the Stoics between time as chronos, right, CH, where only the present exists in time, and time as ion, where instead of a present which absorbs the past and the future, a future and past divide the present at every instant and subdivide it ad infinitum into past and future in both directions at once. The time of chronos, CH, is not unlike Husserl's concept of the living present, in a sense we heard Dan mention. The experiential moment pregnant with retention and protension, past and future. The model of the ion, on the other hand, is the straight line run through by the instant, ever displaced, forking limitlessly into past and future. All right, section 5. We turn once more to Nietzsche. In the famous passage from Zarathustra titled On the Vision and the Riddle, Zarathustra weaves a parable of a conversation between him and the so-called spirit of gravity. Ascending a winding mountain path, the two pause at a freestanding doorway, and Zarathustra poses to his antagonistic fellow traveler a problem. Two paths meet here. No one has yet followed either to its end. This long lane stretches back for an eternity, and the long lane out there, that is another eternity. They contradict each other, these paths. They offend each other face to face. And it's here at this gateway that they come together. The name of the gateway is inscribed above, moment. But whoever would follow one of them, on and on, farther and farther, do you believe, dwarf, that these paths contradict each other eternally? For Deleuze, Nietzsche's brilliance lies in his reflection on the moment itself as the eternal instant, eternal in a sense, in which only the past and future inhere, limitlessly colliding and dividing, each would be present. This infinitely subdivided instant allows only the new to return rather than a revolving ring of identity, as some people interpret the eternal return, a frenzied line of becoming. It is thus not surprising that in the logic of sense, the concept of eternal return is placed in a synonymic chain that also includes the pure form of the ion. Although cinema, too, includes no instances of the word ion, at least that I could find, Deleuze's ionic model of time plays a significant role in the elaboration of the time image. Here it appears only once under the moniker of chronos, CR, not CH, chronos, which is still opposed to chronos, CH. But while it may be tempting to see this importation as a mere application of the ion, as if all he's doing is just taking it and plopping it down, right? It seems rather that in bringing this model into cinema too, Deleuze also complicates it, highlighting an element that is not prevalent in the logic of sense, at least not explicitly so much, namely the virtual. The notion of the virtual contrasted with the actual plays a central role in difference and repetition, but hardly appears, at least explicitly, just 1 year later in the logic of sense. There, the primary ontological distinction occupying Deleuze is the contrast of bodies and states of affairs on the one hand and incorporeal events on the other. But with the translation of the ion into chronos in cinema 2, the virtual returns. And we heard Rob talking about the crystal image. What constitutes the crystal image is the most fundamental operation of time, since the past is constituted not after the present that it was, but at the same time. Time has to split itself in two at each moment as present and past, which differ from each other in nature, or what amounts to the same thing. It has to split the present in two heterogeneous directions, one of which is launched toward the future, while the other falls into the past. We see in the crystal the perpetual foundation of time, non-chronological time, chronos and not chronos. This is the powerful, non-organic life which grips the world. I love that. The powerful, non-organic life which grips the world. This description of chronos closely resembles the structure of ion that we saw in the logic of sense. However, Deleuze draws from this discussion new implications, specifically insofar as what he calls in the logic of sense the instant is limitlessly divided into past and future. The past and future intensively mirror each other within the infinite divisibility of the instant itself, hence the crystal image that we heard Rob talking about. At the heart of the instant, there is a, quote, point of indiscernibility between the, quote, immediate past, which is already no longer, and the immediate future, which is not yet. Virtuality is at play in the frenzied constitution of the present. The present is undone and transformed before it ever is. This is the power of the false. The false has always, until Nietzsche, been characterized simply as a lack of truth. For Deleuze, however, the power of the false, quote, replaces and supersedes the form of the true. It is not, in other words, simply an affirmation of the false, because to assert the false is to still operate under the form of the true, as in, it is true that it is false. Likewise, the power of the false is not error or doubt, like in the Cartesian sense, right? Both of which are again conceived as deviations from the true. It is the power that unsettles the very form of the true, and this power is ascribed when the form of the true is challenged by the form of time, the pure form of the ion. The power of the false is the power of becoming, and it is therefore synonymous with the very powers of life itself that we saw above. Conceiving time in this ionic way elicits a shift in our understanding of the notion of possibility, where the possibilities of multiple eventualities are in fact the pregnancy of the instant with multiple incompossibilities. But contrary to Leibniz's possible worlds, these incompossibles coexist virtually and in a way simultaneously within the real world. And I've got this passage from Borges, the passage from the Garden of the Forking Paths, and you get this description of Fang. Fang, let us say, has a secret. A stranger knocks at his door. Fang decides to kill him. Naturally, there are various possible outcomes. Fang can kill the intruder. The intruder can kill Fang. They can both live. They can both be killed, and so on. In Sui Pen's novel, all the outcomes, in fact, occur. Each is the starting point for further bifurcations. In Deleuze's words, Borges' response to Leibniz is that, quote, the straight line as force of time, as labyrinth of time, is also the line which forks and keeps on forking, passing through incompossible presents, returning to not necessarily true pasts. Leibniz's band-aid for the crisis of truth is ripped off, revealing the bleeding wound of time itself. I like that line. That's mine. Yeah. For Deleuze, this realization reaches the arts in the character of the forger, understood through the power of the false, which, quote, poses the simultaneity of incompossible presence or the coexistence of not necessarily true pasts. Classical truthful narration assumes a logically ordered world where the instants of time connect in the same direct, sequential, linear way that governs Leibniz's notion of possible worlds. Certain events in the narration necessitate certain other events, which ultimately necessitate a specific response from the protagonist in accordance with what Deleuze calls, quote, legal connections in space and chronological relations in time. 5 minutes? Okay. Perfect. But who is the hero of this truthful narration? Deleuze, once more invoking Nietzsche, identifies the so-called truthful man as this hero. For Nietzsche, the truthful man seeks, as we have discussed, the form of the true, in order to measure against it the imperfections of this world. This is a quote. He makes life an error and this world an appearance, and that's from Nietzsche in philosophy. The truthful man of truthful narration is no less nihilistic, no less sanctimonious, and no less resentful. He seeks out the criterion of order and his little collection of facts in order to expose the rot at the core of everyday life. Quote, the truthful man in the end wants nothing other than to judge life. He holds up a superior value, the good, in the name of which he will be able to judge. He is craving to judge. He sees in life an evil, a fault which is to be atoned for, the moral origin of the notion of truth. Falsifying narration, on the contrary, dispenses with the assumptions pertaining to truth. Though Deleuze employs a multitude of literary and cinematic authors, I have this whole section on Orson Welles, still in the footnotes if you want to talk about it later, but to save time. So Wells's F for fake ends with this terrific quote by Wells. What we professional liars hope to serve is truth. I'm afraid the pompous word for that is art. Picasso himself said it. Art, he said, is a lie that makes us realize the truth. Okay, last section, and this is pretty small. This brings us at last to Deleuze's notion of the artist, in particular to her status as a creator of truth, bringing our attention back to the following passage. What the artist is creator of truth because truth is not to be achieved, formed, or reproduced. It has to be created. There is no other truth than the creation of the new. On its face, there are multiple ways that we might understand this passage. We might interpret it in a shallow, sort of bullshitty, relativistic sense, characteristic of all the worst interpretations of postmodernism. That is, we might say that the passage entails that there is no such thing as truth, and the only truth is the one that we human beings assert. And this opens us not only to philosophical problems, but more dangerously, it opens us as well to serious political concerns, because the folks adjudicating in matters of the so-called truth are almost always the ones in positions of power and privilege who use their truth-creating powers to hang on to and to expand that power and privilege. Indeed, in the aftermath of the 2016 United States presidential election, with the hyper-proliferation of fake news and the repeated doubling down on demonstrably, objectively false claims, not the least of which culminated in the storming of the United States Capitol building on January 6th, there were multiple attempts in the public sphere to blame the success of Donald Trump on postmodernism, broadly construed as an absence of truth. But that's not what Deleuze's passage says. Deleuze does not say there is no truth, but rather there is no truth other than the creation of the new. Truth, in other words, is always created, even when it's a truth of the natural world. If it is true that it is raining today, it is because the forces of nature constituted the atmospheric conditions in such a way that rain in this particular location at this particular time resulted. The forces of the natural world created that truth. Truth is always created, Deleuze says. As we saw with the ionic structure of time, it is the return of the different, the miraculous production of the new. The artist, Deleuze says, is one who recognizes this secret of nature and who participates in that creation. But this creation is no less true or no less real than the creations of nature, and its effects likewise are no less true. And for Deleuze, this artistic power is evident most saliently in what we might call, following Deleuze and Guattari's book on Kafka, minor art, the art of the minoritarian. Quote, what is opposed to fiction is not the real. It is not the truth which is always that of the masters or colonizers. It is the storytelling function of the poor. Minor art is first and foremost the artistic mode that sees beyond the world as it is, the world as it can be. Minor art strives to constitute a people against the forces of capital, oppression, exclusion, and domination. Okay, I'm pretty close. It utilizes the power of the false in order to give itself a new truth, a new mythos, a new pantheon, a new history, a new people, and a new earth. It rewrites its own story, recognizing that its story is and can only ever be one that is created and one that can always be recreated. Where the forces of life are impeded, it charts new channels. Quote, there is creation, properly speaking, only insofar as we make use of excess in order to invent new forms of life rather than separating life from what it can do. Now, Deleuze fully recognizes the danger inherent to this power of the false in that it can easily be co-opted by the forces of domination. As he says, the power of the false is delicate, allowing itself to be recaptured by frogs and scorpions, and we might add Cheeto-colored would-be dictators. What then distinguishes between a good use and a bad use of this power? The response is embedded in the way that we have framed the entirety of this discussion. An acute sensitivity to the form of time in the way that Deleuze outlines engenders a deepening of awareness that the powers of life lie in its creativity, in its enabling new expressions of itself and the liberation of new modes of existence. The exercise of the power of the false in order to break down impediments to such liberation will almost always, in Deleuze's sense, be manifestations of goodness or generosity. But finally, I'm going to turn briefly to Nigerian author Chinua Achebe, who explicitly poses the question of the distinction between the fictions that undergird racism, sexism, classism, etc., and the fictions that give birth to a people. His response, I think, is apropos in our reading of Deleuze. Achebe says this: "What distinguishes beneficent fiction from such malignant cousins as racism is that the first never forgets that it is fiction, and the other never knows that it is." It is to bring us back to Nietzsche, an illusion whose illusory status its wielders have either forgotten or more likely repressed. An illusion that immediately places under erasure its own use of the power of the false because it must so eclipse that power in order to then carry out its atrocities in the name of its truth. So the power of the false is admittedly delicate and it is dangerous, but it is important to note tyrants, fascists, and warmongers have been hard at work creating their exploitative truths for millennia. History didn't wait for Nietzsche or Deleuze to talk about the creation of truth before giving birth to humanity's evils. What Deleuze is attempting, I think, is to persuade the minoritarian elements within all of us to reclaim that power of the false that has always been exploited by the powerful, as he sees within it the only genuinely liberatory possibilities. As he claims, quote, "It is the only chance for art or for life." Thank you.